All right, hi everyone and welcome to another video. If you're new to this channel, my name is Patrick and I'm an amateur photographer and sometimes vlogger. And in this video, I want to talk about a question that I get quite frequently from friends, family, even online, and that is, what camera should you buy? I get it frequently enough that I thought it'd be interesting to make a video explaining my thoughts on that question, so I don't have to keep repeating it for people. So, what camera should you buy? The answer is, drum roll please, it depends. Just like everything in life, what you should get depends on what you need and what you can afford and what you're willing to manage and a whole bunch of those sorts of things. That makes sense, right? If you're young and single, you don't necessarily need a 5-bedroom house, right, built for a family. And the same thing is true for cameras. So let's jump into it and talk about what I think you should consider when you're trying to decide what camera you should buy. I think that there are 4 main factors you should consider when you're trying to decide what camera equipment you should get. 1, what do you want to take photos of? 2, what are you going to do with those photos after you take them? 3, how much do you want to spend? And 4, how much equipment are you willing to deal with? Now, let's talk about each of those in a little more detail, and then I'll finish up with some thoughts on different kits for different folks. And if you just want to jump to that part, I'll put that timestamp here. All right, so first, what do you want to take photos of? This is important to think about because different kinds of photography require different kinds of equipment. Here's a list of just some types of photography: landscapes, portraits, travel, street, journalism, wildlife, nature, action, sports, fashion, abstract, family, aerial, architecture, concert, food, fine art, macro, still life, urban, and underwater. And the list goes on and on. Landscape photography, for example, generally uses different equipment than portraits. Travel and street photography is different than both landscapes and portraits. Or if you just want to take pictures of your family when you're traveling, that's something different too. The style of photography you're interested in will inform what kind of camera you might want and what kind of lenses are going to be best suited for you and what kind of other equipment you might need, like tripods, flashes, reflectors, and so on. So you need to give some thought about what kind of photography you're interested in. Of course, you might not know yet, and I'll talk about that a little bit at the end as well. Next, what are you going to do with your photos after you take them? Do you think you'll mostly post them on Instagram? Do you want to print them out for hanging on a wall? Are you going to try to become a professional photographer? Or do you just want memories of your family trips? This question speaks to the quality of the camera you might purchase. Do you really need the most expensive, highest quality camera you can buy? I get a lot of people that ask me if they should buy a $5,000 camera, and they just really don't need it, especially if you're just going to post them on Instagram. You probably don't need a 40 or 60 megapixel camera. The maximum resolution on Instagram is 1080 pixels wide. That 40 megapixel camera is producing images that are like 7,000 pixels wide. That's quite the reduction in pixel count. So if you're just going to post on IG, maybe a 20 or 24 megapixel camera would be sufficient for you. But if you want to print photos and put them up on your wall and you want 20 by 40 prints, then maybe more pixels are going to be more important for you. So think about where those photos are going after you shoot them. Next, how much are you willing to spend on the camera? And it's not just the camera that you need to consider, but all the other equipment you might want or need given the area of photography that you're interested in, like tripods and flashes and so on. And you will never know how much money you can spend until you start spending it on cameras and photography equipment. Man, that money just starts to fly. Photography as a hobby or a profession is not cheap. But also to be clear, I'm not saying that if you don't have XYZ equipment, then you can't do some style of photography. There's almost always some way to be creative with the equipment that you have. I'm not trying to be a gatekeeper here. Just understand that some things are better suited to certain kinds of photography. Now, I did get a question once that I thought was very insightful. They asked me if they had to spend the money, would it be better to spend it on a good camera or spend that money on a photography class or course? And after thinking about that for a while, I told them that I thought a photography course would probably be a better use of their money. Because a fancy camera is great and all, but it doesn't make you a better photographer. A camera doesn't teach you composition or understanding lighting. Only experience can teach you those things. And while you can't necessarily guarantee that a photography course will give you that experience, there's a better chance of that than just getting an expensive camera. Of course, the cheapest option is to just use your phone for a long time before you jump into buying a real dedicated camera. Phones are getting really amazing these days. And with computational photography, they can do things that dedicated cameras can't. Of course, there are trade-offs for those sorts of things, but it's still pretty amazing. and you'll get a lot of mileage out of your phone on your camera if you use it. But nonetheless, if you do want to get a camera, you still need to decide what camera you want. And how much you can or are willing to spend on it is an important factor to consider. Fortunately, I do think that in general there are good options at a number of price points that go from reasonable to excessive for people that want to get into photography. You can find some options where the body is $500 to $600 and a good lens is maybe $200. That gets you something that's going to be really good under $1,000. And then there are a lot of options between $1,000 and $2,000 and $2,000 and $4,000. And then if you get the whole kit and caboodle and you want to get a bunch of high-end gear, then that bill can run up to $10,000 or more. Now, of course, the quality of the photographs and the capabilities of the camera and the various details get better and better the more that you go up in prices. However, I will say that there are diminishing returns for most people as you get higher and higher in price. The benefits you're getting from those high-end cameras are something that really only professionals working in a commercial setting need, but your mileage may vary. Ultimately, the point being here that you should give some real consideration to your budget as you go into buying a camera. Next is one that I think that not many people really consider when getting into photography, and that is how much equipment that you're willing to deal with or buy. It is really easy to start collecting lots of camera equipment. In fact, there's a joke in photography where that tendency is called GAS, or gear acquisition syndrome. In fact, I made a video about it last week. I'll link that here. Now, once you've got all this equipment, it's also really easy to convince yourself that you need to bring it with you every time you go out. Then you go from one camera and one lens, and before you know it, you're carrying 3 or 4 or 5 lenses, a secondary body, a tripod, filters, remote triggers, extra batteries, straps, adapters, and the list goes on and on and on and on. Suddenly you've got a 30-pound backpack full of equipment that you're bringing with you everywhere. Now, this goes back to factor number 1 a little bit, which is what you want to take photos of, because different kinds of photography do need certain kinds of equipment. For example, if you're going to take any kind of long exposure photography, like astrophotography, then you're going to need a tripod to put your camera on. But the point here is that you should do some research and know what kind of equipment is needed for whatever kind of photography that you're interested in, and decide if that's something that you're willing to do or not, or willing to buy or not. If you don't want to lug a backpack full of camera up to the top of a mountain, then maybe that kind of landscape photography isn't for you. Or maybe someday we'll have drone dogs from Boston Dynamics that carry it for us, but then who cares? But until then, think about it. Okay, now that we've gone through the 4 items that I think are important to consider, let's talk about some specific examples. Also, I'm a Sony shooter, so Sony cameras are really the only ones that I pay close attention to. So I'll give my examples with Sony cameras, but this doesn't mean that I think that other camera brands wouldn't do the job as well. If you like another brand, there are usually equivalent cameras in each category. Okay, so on to some examples. First off, what if you don't know what you want to shoot? This is a totally legitimate and realistic situation. When I first started getting back into photography a few years ago, I didn't know what I wanted to shoot either. I didn't know the answers to a lot of the questions that I just talked about. What do you do in this situation? I think you should choose a camera that isn't that expensive. Each camera brand has good entry-level general purpose cameras. For the Sony brand, I think this is the a6000 or a6100 cameras. Pair this with the kit lens that comes with that package, which is a 16 to 55 millimeter lens. And on the APS-C series, this is going to give you around a 24 millimeter to 80 millimeter equivalent range. Now, this isn't the best camera or the best lens out there, but it is perfectly good to start learning and getting good pictures. Then you can spend some time learning what it is that you like, and then you can start adding lenses to your gear or decide if you want to upgrade to a better camera or expand your other capabilities. Then, when you have a good idea of what kind of photography you want to do, and you have answers to some of those questions we talked about, you can upgrade your equipment. Next, the family shooter. Probably the majority of folks I have asking me what kind of camera they should get fall into this category. If you just want to take pictures of your family, like on vacations or sports games, family events, and so on, then you don't really need to buy a bunch of camera equipment. And you probably don't want or need an interchangeable lens system. You don't want to be swapping lenses and dealing with all those shenanigans when you're out touring Italy or something. I think something like the Sony RX10 series, which has a lens that goes from 24 to an absurd 600 millimeters, is a great family camera, and it's got great quality and great performance. I think another option is the Sony RX100 series of cameras, which is a lot more compact. I think this kind of camera could also work for a general travel photography camera as well. I have one of these, the RX100 Mark V, and it's the camera that I bring with me when I'm just running around or out with my family. Next, landscape photography. If you're interested in landscape photography, You might want a camera with a higher megapixel count so you can crop in your images. The Sony a7R series is a great camera for landscape photography. I myself use an a7R III. However, the a6000 series can also do landscape photography as well. I used an a6000 for a while before upgrading to my a7R series. The only consideration here is that you won't be able to crop in the photo as much with a lower megapixel count camera, which means if you want to isolate just one part of the picture and blow it up, then you might run into some quality issues. You also generally want wider angle lenses with landscape photography, like a good 16 to 35 millimeter. You generally will be shooting at apertures above f8, so you don't need an f2.8 or 1.4 lens. You may also want to consider things like a remote trigger if you're going to take longer exposures so you don't shake the camera when you press the shutter release. You will also likely need a tripod to hold that camera still for those long exposure times. Next is portraits. If you want to do portraits, you don't necessarily need a 60 megapixel camera. A 24 megapixel camera will do just fine. So here, I think the a7 III or the a6100 series can do well. There can be some depth of field differences between a full frame sensor and a crop sensor camera, but I'm not going into that in this video necessarily. It'll just generally work for you. Autofocus can also be important when you're doing portraits. And some of the newer Sony series cameras have great eye autofocus, which means that the camera can detect when a person is in the frame and then target their eye to set the focus. This means that you have a higher rate of shots that are in focus. There's nothing more frustrating than thinking that you got a great shot and when you get home and look at them, it's not quite in focus and you can't use it. For lenses, primes are usually going to be what you want for portraits. Primes are lenses that have a single focal length. So instead of being able to zoom from 24 millimeters wide to 70 millimeters tighter, it's going to be just one focal length, like 50, 85, or 135 millimeters. This is because in portrait photography, you often want that out of focus background around the person. This is called bokeh, and is a way of isolating your subject, the person, in the photograph. You get this bokeh by having what's called a shallow depth of field. You can achieve this by having a very large aperture, or opening, in the lens. I won't get into why exactly that is, but suffice it to say that lenses that have aperture ratings of f1.8, 1.4, or even 2.8 lenses will produce this effect for you. And there's a cost, size, quality trade-off for lenses and their aperture. If you want a zoom lens and a large aperture, the cost starts to go up. And generally, the aperture doesn't get bigger on 2.8 with zoom lenses. But with a prime lens, you can get those larger apertures at a usually more reasonable cost. Although this doesn't necessarily mean that you can't spend a lot of money on a prime lens, you certainly still can. Common focal lengths for portrait lenses are 85 millimeters, 100 millimeters, and 135 millimeters. But you could also get away with a 50 millimeter lens in a pinch. Okay, so there are my thoughts on how to choose a camera. If other folks out there in the YouTube world have some other thoughts, I'd love to hear them in the comments, if you are nice about it. And if you have any questions, please let me know down in the comments. Thanks for watching, take care of yourselves, stay healthy out there, and I'll see you in the next video.